We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. We are online at bookedonrock.com. Every episode in both audio and video there, the latest rock book releases, and you can check out the all-new Booked on Rock store. We got a hat, t-shirts, tote bags, sweaters, hoodies, and more. All that at bookedonrock.com. Rik Emmett of Triumph fame returns to the podcast. The singer-songwriter guitarist behind the hit Triumph songs Hold On, Laid on the Line, Fight the Good Fight, Magic Power. Somebody's out there. He's about to release his second book, 10 Telecaster Tales, liner notes for a guitar and its music. The follow-up to his memoir, Laid on the Line, 10 Telecaster Tales, remakes the idea of the concept album. It's music that arrives inside a book. It's also arguably the most comprehensive attempt at liner notes in the history of electric instrumental fingerstyle guitar albums. Emmett delves into the creative process, the roots, influences, philosophy, and spirituality involved in writing and recording, and breaks down the 10 tracks included on his new album titled 10 Telecaster Tales, which you can access through this episode's show notes. We'll also play clips of the songs in this episode. Rik was nice enough to give us permission to go ahead and play those clips throughout the episode. Here is Rik Emmett. Welcome back, Rik.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, I had you on for your first book. Really enjoyed it. So it is super cool to have you back on, and this time to talk about this book right here. The promo for the book states that 10 Telecaster Tales remakes the idea of the concept album. It's music that arrives inside a book. So tell the listeners and the viewers what they can find inside this brand new book.
Essentially, the subtitle kind of tells the story. It's liner notes, but it's the most comprehensive bunch of liner notes because it ended up being 200 pages long, But it was a kind of a bucket list thing for me that I wanted to have something that would be like a hardcover thing with a CD in the back and a book written about an album written about a guitar. It was just this kind of, and it grew organically, but I think the planets were aligned because my editor at ECW Press is Michael Holmes, and he's a guitar player. So, when you pitch an idea to an editor and go, hey, what do you think about this? A book about guitar. He goes, yes, awesome. Great, fantastic, we're in, But I leverage these things too, because I've got a poetry book that will now come out in the fall, in October maybe, called Leaning Into It. And when I go to ECW, I say, now I know you're never going to make any money printing a poetry book, but I really do want to put one out. So if I give you a book about music, will you give me a 2-book deal? And they go, yeah, sure, we'll do that. So I always have, motives that sort of go beyond the, but, when you're an artist, I think you sort of tend to think that way. You tend to sort of go, what else? How else? I keep playing the what if game in my head.
Is this writing thing, is this something you plan on doing long term? Seem to be having fun with it.
Yes. I'd certainly like, well, let me say this. I always want to be creative no matter what. And I retired from the road, but lo and behold, now that this book's out and it seems to be doing all right out of the box, I booked a couple of gigs and I'm going to go play locally. So I'm going to test myself again to see how that goes. I'm not going to go back out on the road again, but that was a pretty large chunk of my life. The idea of performance gives you a sense of instant kind of gratification. You're fulfilled in the moment. The artistic process gives me that too. So when I write, it's arduous. It's not an easy thing to write books, but I really do enjoy the process, and I don't want to become the tortured writer who's drinking too much and, all of those kinds of cliches. And I am here in my garret, but it's a pretty nice garret, It
is nice. I see those guitars behind you.
Yeah.
That looks nice. And actually, I see that window off to the right there, which I believe that's the window you mentioned in your book.
It's faux, F-A-U-X.
Oh.
It's really just a lighted panel.
Right.
Because is no window there.
It's not a window. Yeah, what a terrible way of me describing it.
Well, it was originally a stained glass window in a house that we lived in for like 38 years that was between our kitchen area and our sort of TV room. And then we renovated, and then we moved it literally to an outside window, and it was in an outside window that we made. And then we moved away from the house, and then we brought it with us. And so it was really a place where we went, this could be kind of cool as a library. And you see this over the beam here. That used to be the room. That used to be my studio and my library. And then we made steps up and made this giant, space. Because my wife wanted we call it a Muskoka room here in Canada, like a big, large kind of family room, TV room kind of thing that looked out on the pool in the backyard. And we had a designer, a decorator, and she was standing in that room with me, looking out the back windows. She said, well, if we do this extension off the back of the house, you're going to be looking out at a roof. And I went, yeah. And she said, well, that'll be ugly. Why don't you just go to, once you've dug the foundation, you might as well go up 2 stories. You can have that studio you've always been dreaming about where you'd have windows all around. And I went, okay, lady, I'm in.
And it proved to be beneficial from a creative standpoint. Well, we'll get to that. That's really cool. The opening chapter titled The Real Magic of Layers. So talk about the many layers of making music and how circumstances and environments and the passage of time generate extra layers of supernatural mystique to a song.
Yeah. And I'm not the kind of guy that believes in the supernatural, but I must admit that a lifetime of creative process has made me realize that this layering thing makes stuff come into existence that you didn't foresee, you didn't intend, and yet there it is, Somebody 20 years after me writing a song says, hey, you know what I got out of your tune? This. And you go, that? I never contemplated that, but I can see that it's there. Yeah. So, yeah, this thing of layers it's a really interesting thing. And of course, in my book, I quote the guy from Wilco, Jeff Tweedy, and he talks about that very succinct, very articulate. He kind of nails it. So I quote him because he talks about this fact that we all walk around. Music occupies a space in our heads, and everybody's space is their own. That's one of the beautiful things about music, and yet we share it. And you go, that's an incredible thing. And I think that is another thing that gives birth to this idea of layers, that there's going to be stuff in there that's kind of metaphysical.
And the book proves that there are even more stories that come within a story. In fact, the stories in this book all began with one story, which began very practically: design a guitar. Tell us about your one-of-a-kind Telecaster style guitar, affectionately known as Babs. And for those who are just listening, he's showing it to us now. It's a beauty.
Yeah. It looks like a Telecaster, but it's got Gibson kinds of stuff because it's a Gibson scale length and humbucking pickups and the bridge height. I like when I can get my hand inside the strings, like I like this, digging in with my right hand. Like I'm a left-handed guy, so my strong hand's on the board, which gives me a lot of advantages. But my right hand, I tend to, instead of being a guy that picks like this, I tend to turn my hand sideways a bit. And so I wanted the bridge up. This has been chambered, so it's light as a feather. It's like less than 7 pounds, even with the hardware on it. Ergonomically, I love tellies. I love the waist of a telly, like this distance from the top to the bottom. When I put it on my leg, it just sits so that the strings are in exactly the right place. So there were certain things that Leo Fender got right, as the 40s turned into the 50s, and they decided to call this design a Telecaster. The whole idea of a headstock. I'm trying to get this. There you go. Where the strings are all in a line and the strings pull straight through the nut of the guitar. Like all of that stuff just speaks to me. And of course, the first good guitar that I ever owned was a Telecaster. When I got my union card and started gigging as a professional musician, I had a Tele and a little Fender amp, and the guitar itself has an integrity. A Telecaster speaks honestly. There's dozens and dozens of guitar players that'll go to a Tele because it's the thing that works. And we're talking everybody from Bruce Springsteen and Keith Richards right through to jazz guys, So it definitely is a guitar that works for me. Having said all that, I have the disease and I'll keep searching for the Holy Grail.
Yeah. Count how many guitars are behind Rik. How many?
In this space now, I got about 45, 46, something
Wow.
like that.
That's so cool.
This the limits of the disease for me now. If I was going to be chasing other stuff, then I would, I give guitars away for charity things, or all of my kids have little shrines in their house for their dad with a guitar hanging there and a gold record or something. So there's a company in Canada called Godin, and they're making a model of this that will be available for folks to buy. I haven't seen the prototype, held it in my hands yet, but that's going to be an interesting thing. I thought it was going to maybe be a chapter in the book, but Godin didn't quite get their stuff together in time. So I went, okay, well, if it ever gets to a second printing, we could add another chapter back in. But I think the reality of that is eventually going to occur, and that'll be a cool thing.
What's the story behind the name Babs?
Okay, so this is a standard. When Telly's first came out, they were butterscotch finish with a black guard. And so traditionally, there's an awful lot of guys that play guitars that look like this, because it's really the one that was. And when I first started listening to guitar players and getting into them, Roy Buchanan was a black guard butterscotch player. And he was kind of one of the first guitar players where you went, okay, there's something aesthetically going on here, where there's a marriage between the guys playing, the guitar, the sound, the tone. Just it was one of those things where you kind of get bitten by the bug. So, when I was talking about designing this, it was like, okay, well, that's got to be the way we go. And in the initial things, I was calling the guitar Butter because of butterscotch. And then I started pronouncing it like the way Mike Myers would on Saturday Night Live. He would do an impression of his mother-in-law, and the character was called Linda Richmond. And she would wig in the glasses. She'd be going, and she loved Barbra Streisand. And she would be saying, her voice is like butter. Her voice is like butter. And so instead of calling it Butter, I was calling it Bada. And then I realized, wait a sec, Butter, Barbra Streisand. Hey, her nickname is Babs, and it's blackguard and butterscotch. You get the acronym, and I went, well, I gotta call it that.
That's perfect.
And there is a thing of guitar players, naming their guitars mostly after women, like the way we, used to name storms and ships, and and I realized that that's now an outdated concept, but unfortunately, I'm an old guy. I do things in old-fashioned ways. So I named cars usually with female names.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
When? Oh, patience, my dear, patience. Remember, absence makes the heart grow fonder.
I didn't realize the Telecaster at one time was called the Broadcaster, and then because of television, they changed it to Telecaster. You get into the history of the Telecaster in the book. Really interesting.
Yeah, it was because Gretsch Company had a brand name that they'd already registered, and I think it was on a set of drums. I don't think it was on a guitar, but it was a Broadcaster. And Gretsch sort of told Fender, you can't use that name. And so there was a period of Fender's history where they had the little decals that go on the headstocks, and it said Fender Broadcaster, and they snipped the Broadcaster off. And then for that year, they called them No-Casters. That's what they've become known as, because they don't have the word, but Telecaster became the one that and it was that era, right, where everybody was sort of into the idea of Sputnik and sound waves, and TV was starting to happen in a huge way. And
1951 is when so it was developed in 50, changed the name in 51.
Kind of developed. I think they had working prototypes in 49, and then 50, and then 51 was the No-Caster stuff, I think. And then 52 was when it was a Telecaster sticker on the headstock, and that's when the the real tradition of them started, and I got born in 53. So every now and then, going back to one of your earlier questions, I will go online and I'll be looking at how much 52 and 53 Telecasters cost. And then I go, maybe I'll build one of my own.
This is a fascinating part of the book, one of the many. In your book, you write, quote, "My guitar playing is also informed by my identity as a singer. There's a wide range of stylistic ways that singers end up playing their guitars." Talk about that, because I just saw a video. Edward Van Halen was at the US Festival, and he's talking to Dave Hill, the guitarist of Slade, and he was explaining why he does a lot of the finger work. And he said a lot of that came from the fact that he played piano so much as a kid.
Yes.
So that's very interesting, because I don't know if he ever talked about that before, and you were at that US Festival, by the way, in '83. But yeah, talk about that. So your guitar playing comes from singing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're influenced by music in many, many different ways, right? And if you're a musician and you've been around the block a time or two, I mean, I played violin for 4 years in high school, and that influences me. I sang in choirs when I was a kid, church choir, school choir. And in fact, my voice was kind of my first instrument. So when I picked up the guitar and the voice, that was they were integrated. It was the way I approached music. I started writing songs, and that was a part of the integration. Now, Eddie, you can hear that he's thinking about lots of notes. It's the style of playing, because you've got 10 of them at your disposal on a keyboard. On a guitar, not so easy. You're picking, you can pick 3 or 4 or 5. You can finger only about 4, or 5, 6 if you use a grand bar. But guitar is a little bit different. And the point that you raise about singing, there are guitar players, and Clapton is, I think, one of the guys I use as an example in the book. Very bluesy guy, thinks in bluesy kind of ways, but his playing is very much the way a singer would sing blues. And I think B.B. King was also the same kind of a blues guitar player. The phrasing is very much the way a singer would phrase things. And of course, there's lots of guitar players, and one that pops to mind is Mike Stern, the guy that played with Miles Davis and stuff. Stern is the kind of guy that he studied a lot of sax players because he really liked their phrasing. And the thing about playing sax, of course, is that you've got to breathe. So you're going to play a long phrase, and then you're going to go, you got to take breaths. And I've always said to guitar players, you should breathe more. Like, singers have to breathe, sax players have to breathe, trumpet players have to breathe. Sometimes to be more musical, the phrasing needs to come from something else, because guitar players they can be like guitar weenies and just go forever. They're hammering, and they're doing pull-offs, and they're playing runs, and they're playing scales, and after a while you're going, this is like monkeys on typewriters. Like, there's just so many notes that it doesn't really end up being musical for me. Now, I will grant, because there's people out there that are going like, "Oh, Rick, I really like it when the heavy metal guys, play in never-ending sentences and streams of consciousness." I go, okay, great. To each their own. Chaque son goût. But I'm saying, for me, I like it when it sings. I like choirs. I like phrasing that gives me a chance to kind of think and breathe. So we're talking about taste, but I'm led by the things that I was exposed to.
You also say that most guitarists are cross-dominant. Explain what you mean by that.
Okay, so everybody knows about people that are ambidextrous, right? You can do things with 2 hands. And that percentage of the population is minuscule. But I am something that's called dextro-sinistral. So I do things of gross motor control with my left. I would hammer a nail with my left hand. I throw a baseball with my left hand. My right hand, I use for fine motor control. I write with my right hand. I pick up a fork and eat with my right hand. So fine motor control, gross motor control. And when I first picked up guitar, I was kind of like this. the strumming is a gross thing and the fingering is fine. And I was like this. And then the guy said, my teacher was a guy named Jack Arsenault, and he was a left-handed guy that played right-handed. And he took the guitar and he turned it around in my hands. And he went, you're going to learn this way. And I went, oh, this feels weird. And he said, look, just trust me. Your strong hands on the board. This is going to become a huge advantage for you in a very short period of time. And I think that's true. And the list of guitar players that are dextro-sinistral people, lefties that play right, Paul Simon, Richie Blackmore, Steve Morse, the list is Waddy Wachtel, like from all different styles, all different walks of life. And it's just because you pick up the guitar and you kind of like it, and then give it a couple of weeks or a month, and that guitar's liking you back. Like this natural kind of thing is starting to occur, and it just makes it so that now, though, the right-handed guys are standing around going, geez, Rick, that's amazing that you can do that, I shouldn't make the guys in my high school sound like they were like dumb jocks, because they weren't. It was just a thing of they were envious. So, and I basked in that. That's a nice thing. And that's what I mean about the guitar liking you back. Now you've kind of got this thing that is setting you apart.
Was it Hendrix that played it upside down because he was left-handed?
Yes. Yeah. He played it, backwards and upside down. And I once played in a band with a guy named Chris Brockway, and he was a lefty who played left, and he was a great musician. He was gifted, and he could play a guitar upside down backwards, no problem. But he would play his basses strung the right way, like heavy string on the low string on the top, high string on the bottom. But he could play them both ways. And it was like, okay, that's like, my brain can't handle that, so.
What about the 3 H's, head, hands, and heart? How do they relate to the guitarist inside-out principle?
Yeah, well, the 3 H's. The best music as a player is going to have a combination of those things going. That there's an intellectual thing, there's an emotional component, and then there's this physical, technical thing that you've got going on with the guitar. So your hands are the things that are making the connection happen, but the music is coming from your brain intellectually and your emotions and your spirit and all of that stuff. So it's a complicated thing, but you mentioned earlier that I talked about in the book about layers. There's also this thing about triangles. Like there's a lot of triangulation that occurs in artistic conceptualizing, because you got an idea, free floating, free form idea. If you build a little triangle corral, you can capture the idea. And so that's my theory. It's my working theory. I tend to triangulate things.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Now might be a dandy time for that recess.
Let's talk balance. There's a great quote in the book you include from Leonard Bernstein. He said, quote, "We live in a world of up and down, back and forth, day and night. In order to exhale, we must inhale. There is no third step in the process, no intermediate function. It is in and out, 1, 2, 1, 2. And you reference this when talking about the importance of balance in a song.
Yeah, well, Leonard Bernstein was talking about duality, and how it's this fundamental kind of thing that exists. And when you start writing things, you do tend to kind of go, okay, here's a 2-bar phrase. And now here's another 2-bar phrase. And now I have a 4-bar phrase. And if I take 2 4-bar phrases, I have an 8-bar phrase. That's kind of how music builds itself. And that's in a very fundamental way, of course. There's going to be things that overspan all of that. But nevertheless, those are the fundamental building blocks. So the idea of trying to seek balance, like the idea of a teeter-totter, the idea of how can I get this thing to have a fulcrum and have a range of motion, but it feels natural and it feels like it works. Now, I'm quick to add that, when I would teach songwriting at the college level, I would tell people, you don't want to have everything balanced all the time, because if everything's balanced, it gets boring. You do need to unbalance a structure sometimes in order to create a sense of an impending something, or you want to accelerate the form, or you want to decelerate the form in order to have people go, oh my God, I think a chorus is coming. And then boom, the chorus hook lands and you go, oh. And if you didn't unbalance things, you wouldn't have created that sense of momentum and feeling. But generally speaking, music works, and I'm a songwriter. So, even though these are instrumental guitar pieces in the 10 Telecaster Tales, they're songs. And, you write a song and you kind of go, okay, I have a verse. I guess I'll need a chorus. And then you get a verse and a chorus and you go, okay, I'm going to need a second verse. It's going to be like the first verse. I'm probably going to need a third verse. And threes, we're talking about duality, but 3 is a pretty standard kind of construction as well. Songs kind of have 3 verses. And then sometimes they have a bridge, which is the vacation from all of this balanced activity. You go, we need to break it down, or we need to take it away and then bring it back so that it'll have this satisfying return, which is, again, sometimes I love when you see guys that can juggle. And they're comedians. They kind of talk and they're doing their act and they're showbiz. And they can juggle 2 things and then they add a third and then they add a fourth and then they add a fifth. And it's all part and parcel of this is what you're doing. And as an artist, that's what you're doing too, but he's still only got 2 hands, and eventually the show itself is going to come to a nice, balanced, this was my presentation, thank you very much, And so that balancing act, that juggling act, is also part of the duality.
Based on feel, though, too, I would think, because you mentioned Clapton, I always think about the song, it's in the way that you use it. It starts with the main chorus. What goes into that decision to say, let's start with the chorus rather than let's build up to it?
Well, I think people that have been at songwriting and record making and record production for a long time, then they're seeking ways to try to make a song better, more memorable, more powerful. And the thing that I talk about a lot is being a song detective, that you get to the point where you're trying to get yourself out of the way. You're trying to get your own ego out of the way so that you can hear or detect what the song is trying to tell you it wants to become. And sometimes, and I don't know if you've read Rick Rubin's book, but, there's a producer that, has everything from the Chili Peppers to Johnny Cash to, the guy's had a lot of success. And he's a guy that's a real kind of Zen song detective kind of guy who would be in a studio situation and would say, hey, what if we tried starting with the chorus? So he's not the only one. I think lots of guys arrive at that. They go, let's try that. Let's see how it works. And when you kick the tires in the studio, you're going to do a lot of tire kicking. That's why you have studios, so that you can sort of indulge yourself in the luxury of, well, let's try something different. Let's try it a different way and see how it works. So I'm not really a start with the chorus kind of guy. I'm maybe, and I've written hundreds, maybe thousands songs in my life, maybe more. And sometimes, I have tried it, but generally speaking, I kind of like the idea of, and I'm old school, right? I was cutting my teeth when there were rock and roll bands were turning into prog bands. And I kind of liked prog, And so I liked the idea of the more parts you could have. You could get a song on FM radio in the 1970s and in the first part of the 80s, where you could have like an intro in halftime, a slow intro. Oh, and then the groove would kick in, and then another verse would come along that would be an entirely different verse than the intro chunk was. And then you get to the chorus, and then you have a bridge, and then you have a breakdown with the disco section in it, et cetera, et cetera. I liked that,
Yeah, like a song like the Beatles' Help starts right away with that. And that comes during a time of AM radio, and that was beneficial to come right in with it. But I just found out that was a song that John Lennon wrote as a ballad.
Yeah.
I think maybe it was George Martin. This is a perfect segue to my next question. I think maybe it was George Martin, but having somebody to step in and say, let's try this differently. How important is that? Because you do write about engineering and production, and this can be tricky because you say beauty's in the eye of the beholder and in the ear of the listener. How important is that? And do you prefer self-producing, or do you like having an outside producer?
I like both. Yeah. And, a lot of times it sort of depends on the process. When I write something like 10 Telecaster Tales, it's very personal. It's self-expression, and I wouldn't be keen on collaborating during the creative process. But when it comes to recording, I'm very lazy, and I don't like having to engineer my own stuff. I am opinionated when it comes to producing, but I also like collaborating. Like, I'll give you a little anecdotal story. The other night, I went to see a couple of my pals. Peter Cardinale, he runs a label called Alma, and an artist that he has signed to his label is Don Breitup. And Don and I have done some co-writing together. And they were in the studio locally here. So I drove up one night and was sitting there and listening to what they were doing and working on this thing that they were sending to somebody in Japan. I don't know, whatever. So they're working on this tune. And they got a singer out on the floor, and they're putting a voice on a demo. So, they're working on, and they get towards the end of the tune, and they have a half chorus come back at the end of the tune. And there's this kind of kick line that goes like, I don't think about you, or something like that. And of course, it's one of those things where the singer, she's not really saying, I don't think about you. No, it never crossed my mind. You don't cross my mind. That was the line. You don't cross my mind. Or it never crossed my mind, something like that. But she's protesting too much. The singer is actually saying that because she's regretting it. She's thinking about it all the time. You know that Missing You? Remember John Waite?
Yeah, John Waite. Yeah.
Missing you. I'm not missing you. But of course, what he's saying is, I'm missing you all the time, right? So it was one of those kinds of songs. And she gets to the end and she's singing the line, it never crossed my, you don't cross my mind. And I went, instead of and the line was sort of phrased like, you don't cross my mind, you don't cross my mind, something like that, or you don't cross my mind. And I went, you should slow it down. Like, I can't keep my mouth shut. I'm in the studio. It's not my session. And I say to the guys, what if at the end you slowed it down and you hung it, you added 2 beats so that she could go, you don't cross my mind. And it would be this really kind of defeated, she's saying it, but she doesn't, she means exactly the opposite. And it's heartbreaking that she's had to, spent the last 3.5 minutes trying to cope with the fact that she's, broken and obsessed. And they went, oh, Rik, that's a great idea, thing. And I'm sitting there thinking, uh-oh, I shouldn't have opened my stupid mouth. This is not my session. This is not my song. But I couldn't help myself. So collaborating, to answer your question, sometimes it's an impulsive kind of thing. And I really do enjoy it. I like being with other gifted, creative people and kicking the ball around. Like, I played, when I did sports, when I was a jock in high school, I was good at track, but I didn't like the stress and the anxiety of that as much as I loved being in the relay. And then being on the football team, that was even better. Like, I love the idea of collaborating and making good things happen on that basis. But art sometimes has to be about you saying, like, if those guys had reacted to me and said, Rik, keep your ideas to yourself, thanks, but no thanks, like, this is our thing. I would respect that. And I would say, been there, understand that, totally, forgive me. I shouldn't open my mouth. But certainly for me, back to your original question, engineering, production, like, man, the more help I can get, the better. I really feel like, and we live in a digital universe now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, man.
To that, as a fan, I've said this before, all of my favorite artists and bands, if they put out something that is controversial, maybe that the fans don't dig so much, like Metallica with the Lulu album and Van Halen 3, and the fans say, oh, I don't like this. I still will always say, as a fan, I want my favorite artists to do what they want to do creatively. It's what they wanted to do. With Van Halen 3, it was produced by Mike Post, and he said that he really laid off and didn't do much. And I wonder if maybe that album needed some of that, though. Maybe somebody needed to step in and say, hey, we should shorten that up or change that chorus. I don't know, but that was a controversial album for them.
I know. And I just read Ted Templeman's book, and I think he did have not a heavy hand, but he was very much a guy that was in there going, look, here's what I think you need to do in order to get on the radio. Here's what I think you need to do to tighten up what this band is all about. Because the band was all about the marriage between David Lee Roth and then, the Van Halen brothers. And that was back to the idea of balance. That was a thing that was tricky, but it had to work, and it worked. When it worked great. And then when it blew up and it didn't work so good anymore, in comes Sammy. And for a while that worked great. And I think Templeman was a guy that could see, this is how I balance these very volatile, very, aggressive, high energy kinds of components. Templeman was good at that. He made those things happen. Yeah. And, there's records that I love where you can clearly hear that the producer did, in fact, like Eddie Oford on the early Yes albums that I love, like Fragile and Close to the Edge and stuff. They're clean and tidy. Like Steely Dan records are so clean. Like they're so amazingly great. And, in the early stages, they had Gary Katz. And I think he was the guy that sort of said, this is how you do it, boys. And then Fagen and Becker learned, right, okay, at the feet of the master, this is how we must approach it in order to make it be a realization of our total approach. Because those records are probably as good as records get.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Short pause. Hold your breath for the dynamic duo.
Rik Emmett is here to talk about his brand new book, 10 Telecaster Tales, liner notes for a guitar and its music. And there's music to go along with the book. It's a collection of songs, 10 Telecaster Tales, which you can also get. That's in CD form. We can talk about, there's a deluxe version of the book, but I know these songs are on Spotify. I put together this episode's playlist, and you could find the songs by going to the show notes. Collection of 10 beautiful instrumentals. So let's talk about some of those. The lead track, So Pushy, is important because you say that's what led you to the idea of the whole album of fingerstyle electric guitar playing. So let's start with that song.
I had written a poetry book called Reinvention, and I had little pieces. And So Pushy was a little 12-bar jazz bluesy thing. So I started, and I was thinking, well, I could turn that into a tune. It's going to need a little bit of embellishment. It's going to need a B section. And then I still felt, I'm not all the way there yet. And then I said, this needs like an intro that would be like, what would, I don't know, Jimmy Page do? What would Ted Nugent do? Like, I need a riff that's like kind of not big and dumb, but something that's just a powerful bluesy kind of thing. So then I came up with this thing. It was like, and I went, that's great. I'm going to do that 4 times, and then I'll go into the 12 bar, and then go through a couple of 12 bars, have a B section, and then come back to the. And when I did that, I realized, okay, this is a done deal. I got this tune is happening. And then it was kind of like, because of that, now I created a sense of momentum. A lot of the other the energy that I needed to be starting to find other pieces of things and start building things, being inspired by stuff around me. I was going, hey, and meanwhile, of course, the guitar's being designed and we're going, I'm thinking, these things that I'm writing, it was COVID and our house was being renovated. We were living in a barn. I was starting to feel like, okay, I'm going to write a barn dance suite of stuff. And I can play all of these on the telly when I finally get the telly. So it was like all of this stuff was kind of coalescing. And you start to feel like a project creatively has momentum. It's like you climbed on the Derby racer at the top of the hill, and now it's not going to stop unless it crashes.
And the tracks Funky, Scratchin', and Slinky, those are more in your wheelhouse, whereas songs like So Pushy and Gee Whiz are not.
The real challenge for me was the ballads, like the Allemande, which is a very stately dong dong ding dong dong ding dong. It has to be very courtly, very stately, and that's hard for me. I like to push notes, syncopate things. A tune like, say, Gee Whiz on the album is a walking bass, boom ba boom bong bing bong dong ding do dong ding dang do, and that kind of stuff. It comes to me naturally, but it's a bitch. It's just really hard to play because you're playing a walking bass note, but you're trying to grab chords and you're trying to put melody on top, and so it's like that sort of Joe Pass, Chet Atkins kind of territory where I'm going, oh man, have I bit off more than I can chew? But once I get it under my hands, I can handle that stuff. It's the ballads, There's a piece at the end called Nocturne, which is very kind of sad, very floating and drifting and like snow on a moonlit night, kind of. It has to have that feeling. It makes me start to think about funerals and family members that have passed away. And it's just like, as I say in the book, it's like the valley of the shadows. And I don't like going there. I don't like hanging around there because it's kind of sad, But I do think if you're an artist, you do have to go to these places and you have to push yourself to try to find the discipline to make that work. Because if you don't have, minor key things, then your joyous major chord stuff like Funky Scratchin' is this easy thing for me that's based on the bluesy stuff that when I was a teenager, and it's happy and it's energetic, and that's an easy place for me to go, and I love being there. But if I want it to have its full impact, I got to go to this is back to what we were talking about before, about balance. Like if you don't go dark sometimes, then the light won't seem as bright when it comes, when it happens. So you need contrast and you need the balance of contrast.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
You must not see anybody or talk to anybody. Anything you do could have serious repercussions on future events.
Swirling is beautiful, and this is one of those songs has that beautiful breezy summer afternoon by the brook kind of feel to it. And this is where we get to the Faux, the new recording studio. This kind of influenced that, right? That was the difference because before you were recording in a cellar, I think.
Yes. And as I sit here, you guys can't see it. Maybe I could spin this around so that you can get a look. Like, here's what I'm looking at. See all those windows all the way around?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that to me is like all my life I was in studios where I was in a basement or a place that had no windows, So this was more for the writing than anything else, just so that I would have a creative space where I could see trees and wind and clouds and sky, and my imagination could then move towards sort of more organic kinds of feelings. And it it's been very good for me. It's like it has really worked. And it's nice now that I've got this location for doing all this, filming and videoing and blah, 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 like it's just a nice location to have now. As far as that affected swirling, the metaphor there was not necessarily what I was seeing out the windows. It was a river, and rivers, they show up and work all the time, right? The idea of current and the idea of this thing is it's like time, it's flowing by, and life is like a river. And Springsteen talks about the river, and everybody talks about the river. Somebody's good one, I think it was David Byrne, he'd take me down to the river and dip me in the water and all that kind of stuff. It's a standard. I mean, you get baptized in water, we're born out of amniotic fluid, but of course that once I had a waltz thing going on in that tune, that dum da dum bang dum dum 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3, and so that was like, okay, we're flowing, and we want to have the skirts kind of flowing, and then it was like, oh yeah, this is like the river. And so then when I was recording, I said to Blair Packham, was my engineer, I was going, I think we're going to need like a phase shifter or some flanging. We got to make the atmosphere kind of going like, whoosh, whoosh. We want that feeling. That was cool. That was effects after the fact. But, to me, that's one of the things that really makes that thing work, is just the sound texture of it.
That one, the song Cowboy and Gaucho Waltz, are ones where you say that you can get carried away too easily using your right-hand fingernails to flail away on the strings. That can overload certain frequencies. Is this something where we get into the engineering part of it or the mixing part?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it starts with stuff like, you see these nails? These are acrylic nails, and I get them painted on at the local salon and then backfilled once they start growing out. And they're hard as rock, and they're great. But once I start flailing away on strings with them, and the Gaucho Waltz is like, it has that sort of and so it creates all of these upper frequencies, these things that are like really high, incredibly not what you want treble that's sizzling away, and you go, how do we get rid of that? And so you're using graphic EQs and you're trying to yank that stuff out. But yeah, and if I had spent more time in pre-production, I would have realized, well, I should probably be playing that not as hard, and I should set the amp in a different way and set the mics off of the amp in a different way, and I should use maybe a different preset when I'm doing it. I should alter the part a little bit, so instead of playing closer back by the bridge, I play a little closer up over by the neck, so that it's a little bit warmer and rounder on the originating sound, But, you live and learn, right? And sometimes a mistake is happy, and it's kind of something that gives a piece of music its character, its unique character. Other times it's a mistake, but we were talking about this earlier. You're talking about Van Halen 3. Sometimes it's important for an artist to make a mistake, because you learn from mistakes, and the things you learn from mistakes will stick with you and form you far more than somebody going, you're great, oh, that's great, just keep doing the same thing, man. And David Bowie would say, no. You know what's interesting? When you get out in the water and your feet can't touch the ground anymore, like, you can't find bottom, and now there's a little bit of danger. And I think There's great truth to that.
I just did a David Bowie episode. An author who wrote a book, he talked about that. Bowie was not afraid to make a mistake. I don't think he was afraid of criticism either. I mean, I'm sure it hurt, but he would rather take a chance and fail than not at all.
And I think that's true of people, like even the people that do end up having incredible commercial success. Let's say right now, Taylor Swift, maybe as a precursor to her, Madonna. You do have to have a kind of a spine of titanium, because you have to be no fear. I'm going to do this because I feel like this is what an artist should do. And this is right for me at this time, even if it's a mistake. In the long run, it's going to be something that moves me ahead and opens me up and makes me become a better me. So yeah, that thing about fear, that's a really interesting thing. Like the corollary to Bowie's, going in over your head is, I would say, yeah, just don't swim out so far that the riptide gets you and you get carried away. Like,
well, you could lose your audience, right? If you do too much of it. Yeah.
You could lose your life. Like, quite literally, there are artists who think, yeah, this heroin thing's awesome. Yeah, well, maybe not. Like, maybe you shouldn't get out where the riptide's going to get you, And I try not to be too judgmental about other folks, but I do end up having my own sense of critique. I want to have a very strong sense of, well, that's not for me. This is for me, and this is what I'm going to try, So judgment is a weird thing. We're all human and we're all going to have it, but I don't think you necessarily want to be too judgmental of your own ideas too early in the game. You want to give them a chance to kind of, grow their own legs and breathe on their own,
Sure. I had a musician on, he wrote a great book he teaches music. I think he taught Paul Stanley's son too in New York. But anyway, it's just a quote that stuck with me regarding criticism. And he said he always told his students, and this is what he would do, if somebody criticized his work, read it over and over again until it doesn't affect you anymore. I thought that was interesting because some people choose to avoid it. Maybe I don't want to read what people write about my music. He chose to just take it head on and say, just keep reading it until you develop a thick skin to it.
Yeah, I mean, yes, thick skin can be bad for you, because I think you do have to remain emotionally responsive and empathetic. Like, I think there's a lot of shit going on in the world right now where there's too many people that are not empathetic enough to other folks. And, I think for sort of, I don't know, democratic, liberal kinds of communities to work, which is to say countries and the planet Earth, we have to have a kind of we can't be so thick-skinned that we're just going like, fuck you, that doesn't work on large scale kinds of things. Municipalities can't work that way. States and provinces and governments can't work that way. You have to figure out a way to be empathetic to what other people are saying and so by the same token, I think your point and the point of the guy is a good one, that you do have to arrive at a point where philosophically you can say, okay, I can see where they're coming from. And I'm not going to necessarily let that color my own judgment or color my own choices. But I will take it into account because, but having said that, I would tell students in a college music classroom, look, you don't have to get everybody to like you. That's not how it works. You only have to get a certain group of people to like you and support you because of the fact that you're showing them that you make pretty good choices most of the time. And I mean, not to put too fine a point on things here, but, Trump got, I don't know, 48% of the popular vote or something, more than, Harris did. But half the voters that can vote didn't even vote. And there's another 25 or 30% of the people that are living in your country and they don't even get to vote. So, when somebody says, well, we have a clear majority. Yeah, that's fiddling with the actual facts. That's fudging the way that truth should work. So in truth, I think as an artist, you have to have an open mind. You can't close, your skin can't get so thick that ideas can't get through to you.
Yeah, there's the balance. You got to balance it. You can't be too far on one side or the other. We were talking about your style of playing having to do with being a singer, and so kind of want to go back to that because there's a quote in the book. You say, I have to fully commit to quality time in the woodshed where I must relearn lessons about control, restraint, and the emotional power of letting notes speak in eloquent phrases before I rush ahead to more and more notes. Now, this is in reference to Allemande and Rio Glide and Winter Nocturne. Expand on that a little bit if you can.
Well, in the specific case of Rio Glide, I was rehearsing it last night, and it's like it's a very laid back kind of Brazilian samba-ish kind of boom 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 boom. And it only works if you stay on the back side. Ooh, ding da, ba dee da, doo doo dee doo. It has to glide, and if you start going like now you've turned it in, it's a parody. It's not working. It's and it's a really difficult thing for me because I am more like the guy that wants to go boom ding 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 ding. I want to push the thing. Want to push. I like playing like back in the day, Triumph, I was the rock and roll machine, so that energy, I have to learn how to be able to go, whoa, relax, sit back, get on the back side of the beat, be a little lazy. That's okay. That's going to make this piece work. And then there's some times where in a ballad, like Nocturne or Allemande, there's places where you get through a phrase to a note that needed that time to breathe, and you didn't need to rush to the next thing. That's really hard for me. I am not wired to try and to let that happen, but this comes back to a thing where I'm going to go all the way back to when I was a kid and I'm singing in the choir, and you're learning how to sing, and you're realizing that a song is a really beautiful thing because it's almost like this mask you can wear, a costume it's a thing you can inhabit. You kind of commit yourself to the song. You become the song. So if you do that, now the song is the thing that can lead you to a good performance of the song because you're letting it be the thing that dictates. You're not being you, you're being the music. And I know that sounds, esoteric and bizarre and weird, but I swear most good musicians learn that when they're kids and when they're teenagers, they've realized, oh yeah, the music has to be the thing that leads. So there are things that organically, they're a challenge for me. They're harder, but if I'm going to write a book and I'm going to be comprehensive about it, I have to also be transparent. I have to be honest. I have to say, look, you might think, oh, Rik is a master of everything. And I go, no, Rik is not. Rik has severe challenges in some respects. And, these are the things that I struggle with. And I do it so that hopefully other musicians, other people that are maybe, pursuing artistic endeavors might be able to go, huh, that's good. Well, I learned from that. That's great.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
There will be an intermission.
Interesting inside revelations, too, on the song Burley Town, where you mentioned Stephen Marley and Also, the song's DNA is in a Triumph song we all know well, Fight the Good Fight, from 1981's Allied Forces.
Fight with Gil, Moore, the drummer in Triumph, he had this ba 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 ba. That's kind of what he wanted. He wanted to, on a snare drum, he wanted to go, and so he had this lick, and it was like, can you find a riff that goes with that? So we had that, and then we had this groove now that was like, boom, a cat. It was very John Bonham, boom, chap, boom, chap, to boom, chat, to boom, chat, and so. I'm starting to, and it's turning into reggae, and we're getting this because it kind of comes right out of that boom whack, boom whack, boom boom jack, boom boom jack, and the bridge was like this, down to the boodle, and Gil was playing like boom boom boom, boom boom. Boom, ba-doo, ba-da-ba-da-ba, in the B section of the song. This is reggae, right? Cha-cha, cha, cha-cha, cha, boom, cha-cha, cha. So I'm going, I like this. Like, this is a really cool, global kind of appeal is in this rhythm. So I go back to reggae time and time again for things. And so I had a couple of these little ideas, riff ideas and stuff. And I was thinking about my hometown, Burlington, where I live. It has a long tradition of a teen touring band, kids that, like a marching band. And so on a spring day, you can go for a walk and you can hear them in the park practicing, the drum guys doing their things, having a sectional rehearsal. Sometimes they're walking around in the park and they're all like, so you go, wow, that's a cool tradition to have in a city. But we have music festivals, and we have jazz musicians, and we have country and Western folks. There's bars where you can go and hear all kinds of great music. Plus, it's a waterfront town. So there's piers and there's bridges and there's, like lakefront, and you can walk. And those are constantly full of things like, guys they've set out their hat and they're playing their tunes, and they're just hoping for somebody to chuck a couple of. We have loonies and toonies here. Hey, where are you from?
I'm in the U.S. in Connecticut.
Okay.
But I think of the word buskers. They're buskers, right? Street buskers. Yeah,
exactly. And I've always felt like, talk about independent minds, like a busker. Sometimes they're out there. I once wrote a song that was kind of about, I can't remember the title of it. It was on my Good Faith album. And it was about a guy that was out busking and how, he had this freedom that a guy like me doesn't get to enjoy. You're rehearsing bands and you're out and you got this guy, he can choose any song he wants,
Absolutely.
Right? He's got no boss, He doesn't have to have a union card, Although I think buskers now, do they not sort of, municipalities sometimes make them register? And
I want to go back to Chet Atkins and Joe Pass, because you mentioned them earlier. Chet Atkins, the name is pretty well known. Joe Pass, not so much, which he really should be. And this is in reference to the track Gee Whiz. And you get to sneak in some quote unquote show off stuff.
Well, I mean, I had gone to a jazz music college for all of one semester, but when you're in that kind of a world for a little bit of time, it's there's all those guys. Joe Pass is one of the giants. Barney Kessel, Wes Montgomery, Hal Farlow. There were all Jimmy Rainey. There were all of these guys, and they were all part and parcel of a scene where there were big bands. There was the idea of bebop. All of this stuff had influenced guys to become jazz guitar players on a really high level. And Pass was the one that sort of became more of a solo fingerstyle kind of guy. And if I was going to pick sort of my three favorites, I would say Joe Pass, a Canadian guy named Ed Bickert, and a sort of a New York-centric kind of guy, Jim Hall. And they're so influential on, so like Pat Metheny would say, oh, Jim Hall, like, man, you know. But everybody kind of knows Joe Pass because he was the guy that could play all the standard repertoire, but on his own. He'd play Duke Ellington. He would play Gershwin tunes and just, you know, knock them out of the park. There's another name I want to mention there, Marty Gross. He was a guy that was a big influence on that Gee Whiz tune because he was the guy that did the sort of walking bass chord change, chord. I saw him once in a thing called The Great Guitars. Maybe Joe was a part of that. I think Bickert was maybe a part of that. But Marty would play these things like, he had a song that was like, I got a chord for every note I sing. Doom, doom, ding, chord. I got a chord for every note I sing. And it was like these songs from sort of the 20s turned into the 30s. And the whole thing of, you know, the roaring 20s and then the Tin Pan Alley stuff. And Marty was just a master of that stuff. And people can find him. There's clips on YouTube, NPR, Marty doing his thing. But anyhow, I always liked that because I thought this is a very complete way of playing guitar. You're walking a bass line, you're playing chords, there's melody happening. And Marty Gross talks about, you know, it cooks. And he likes it because it sounds fat. And I go, no, I get that. I understand that. And Joe Pass was a guy that liked it when it was fat. He played flat wound strings and he could just make it swing so hard by himself. You know, it was like a complete kind of symphonic statement coming off 6 strings, you know, and you just go, okay, like I like that. I would like to have some of that in what I'm doing, you know, and I always kind of like that. I like heavy metal guys that approach their playing with that kind of idea of voicings. Now, I'm going to skip to something because I was having a conversation with some other musicians the other day, and they were talking about how Ed Bickert, one of my favorite jazz guitar players, also a guy that could make this his harmonic understanding was extremely high level. And sometimes he would, on the bandstand, he would lean over to the keyboard player and say, hey, do you mind? Just don't play. Just, will you lay out? Because he's got his own ideas about harmony, and he wants a harmonic, and he needs space in order to be able to make it happen. And we're having this conversation now about guys like Joe Pass. Joe Pass was a guy that sometimes, yeah, I think the best way for me to play this gig would be solo. Yeah, I'm going to just play solo. Like, he doesn't want anybody else getting in the way because he wants the space to be able to do what is a very complete musical statement to him. He doesn't need other instruments in order to make it happen. So there's a part of me, like, I think people that are like folk Nazis, you know, that they only want the,
Yeah.
like, they can appreciate that. They might not appreciate the jazz style music, but that philosophical approach, they would go, no, I really dig that. Yeah, I want a purity of approach.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
Now you wait here. I'll be right back.
All right, we wind down with the final track, and you did mention it before, but let's go back to Winter Nocturne, and this is the end of the story cycle, so it was a perfect track to end the collection of songs with.
People often ask when you're a writer, like, hey, Kay, where do ideas come from? You know, how do you, what's your process? Where do you start? Do you start with melody? Do you start with chords? They come every way possible. They, you know, I don't limit myself as to, oh, this is my process and this is the only way I do it. Now that we have a digital world and I have an iPhone with, you know, voice memos, sometimes I'll get an idea and I'll just sing something into it. You know, sometimes it's a groove idea. Boom, chaka, boom, 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 chaka, chaka, boom, chuba, chaka, you know, whatever. It's nonsense, but they're seeds. and sometimes if you can get a seed into fertile ground and a little bit of water, hey, some things can happen. So I had a seed of a couple of weird little chords up the neck. But when I was listening back to the iPhone little, chord thingies that I'd played off my guitar, I realized, this is E minor on a guitar, lots of open strings. And it's not, according to Spinal Tap, it's not the saddest of all keys. D minor is apparently the saddest of all keys. But E minor is a pretty prolific guitar key because there's lots of open strings and there's lots of ways you can go. And there's lots of beautiful, easy harmonics that can ring off the guitar. Now, when I first started in Triumph, I had a piece called Moonchild that was part of a thing called Blinding Light Show that was on the very first Triumph album we made. I'd written that piece when I was in college, so I was still a kid, but it was E minor. It had E minor harmonics. And then I was thinking, if I revisit that, not as, wanting to lift the licks or anything, but just to find the mood of that piece and the spacing and where I was coming from, but don't lose the thread of being in a very sad, reflective place. So the sort of poetic metaphor that I mentioned earlier of moonlight on sort of freshly fallen snow, so that you get that crystallization, you get those sparkles, the wind comes and then there's a little bit of snow that drifts down off the cedar. Just that kind of a atmosphere, but also being real sad because I'd lost my dad recently. And so there was, dealing with that grief. And I went, well, be there, go there, live there, find the chords for that, find a chord sequence that makes that kind of feeling work. So, a nocturne is generally something that's like a late night kind of rumination. So I think one of the things for me creatively, the fact that I'd written a book of poetry and then was also now continuing to write poetry as one of the creative things that I do, write guitar pieces, write songs, write poetry. I think poetry has had a really good influence on me as a musical creator because now I search for the poetic in the musical things that I'm composing and that I'm writing. That's become a lot more important to me. So I mentioned phrasing earlier as a thing. And there's a lyricism that you're also looking for, a lyrical approach to the way you phrase things and the way things come together and the way the things sort of pile up on each other and integrate. So I think that was something that I learned in my 70s.
Well, the book's out March 25th, I believe, right? That's the release date. 10 Telecaster Tales, liner notes for guitar and its music. So the music is out now, though. I know people can find that. I know it's on Spotify. I believe the songs are on YouTube as well.
It's streaming on all kinds of things. The guy that helped me with my streaming sent me a text the other day, says, hey, it wasn't up on Deezer, but we got it on Deezer now. And I go, okay, what's Deezer? And he goes, oh, no, it's pretty big in Europe. I'm like, it's a lot of people I go, okay, great. There's people that are far hipper than I am at this kind of stuff. But apparently I'm on like 20 different streaming platforms now.
All right.
Which is great. And I've never really chased that kind of stuff before. But you can also download it at bandcamp.com. You can get your own downloads if that's the way you want to get it. And of course, I don't know if there's still any for sale, but at visionmerch.com, the hardcover versions of the book looks like this. And they have the actual CD in the back. I think they cost like $150 though. So, they have an autograph in a book plate on the front. So it's the real, if you're a diehard, you can get that. Otherwise, it's like $20 or $30 for the paperback and you can just stream it.
Well worth it. You can get the book on Amazon and all the usual places too. And you have a website?
I do. www.rikemmett.com. Rik, R-I-K, E-M-M-E-T-T. But I don't do much commerce anymore. I kind of put it all out to third parties now. Vision Merch is really a good place to go.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes so people can access it there. Rik Emmett, thank you so much. Great to talk to you again. And maybe we'll have you on again for the poetry book.
Yeah, excellent. I look forward to it. Thank you, Eric. This was a lovely conversation.
That's it. It's in the books.